So this webinar session is designed to empower election officials, not alarm them. Doxing, unfortunately, is a real threat, but one that needs to be understood, prepared for, and sometimes managed. Every segment and all the amazing professionals that we have here today will help reinforce that election officials are also in charge of their own safety. And we'll be kind of talking through that. We do have three amazing panelists, which we'll get to here in a second. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders. This webinar is being recorded, so if you need to leave and come back later, or you want to come back and rewatch it, please feel free to do so. Also, make sure that if you do have any questions, to talk to your legal counsel. Unless the standard lawyer stuff, to make sure that you talk to your legal counsel to see if you have any specific questions. You're also more than welcome to reach out to Election Security Exchange, where we can help where we can. So I first want to turn it over to Cynthia Kaiser. Cynthia Kaiser, and she is amazing. She spent more than 20 years at the FBI. She was most recently the Deputy Assistant Director for the Cyber Division, where she helped manage policy, intelligence, and partnerships focused on disturbing and disrupting cyber threats. She served on the Cyber Safety Review Board and delivered the President's daily briefing to White House officials across two administrations. Her team's work contributed to disruption of major ransomware groups such as Lockbit and Quackbot. She's also been part of the FBI team that helped with the Enemies of the People doxing campaign that was done by Iranian cyber actors back in December of 2020. Cynthia now leads the Ransomware Research Center at Halcyon. Cynthia, thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I'm really excited to be here with everyone today. Walk through just a few aspects. I want to hit on the enemies of the people, right, in particular, and walk through how that looked for election officials, for federal officials across the nation, how it kind of was set up, and what it tells us for how to prepare for some of these doxing type threats. So, first, I think everyone here knows what doxing is, right? But just to level set, it's just putting information that's personal out about you online, often with the intent to harm or harass. And like as a part of this, it fit in with this larger Iranian campaign that we saw in 2020. So in kind of the fall of 2020, we saw an Iranian campaign start where they were looking to specifically undermine Americans' faith in the US democratic process. And really, at first, it was to try to create the appearance that election results couldn't be trusted, cause people to lose confidence, whatever, kind of all those things you can say. It's to undermine all of us, right? It's to undermine American democracy. They specifically tailored messages to reach different audiences with different messages. So identified Republicans were targeted with one set of ideas, while identified Democrats were targeted with a completely different set, right? So it was across the board. They're looking to cause chaos overall. It was built on a foundation of illegal activity. So stealing information about voters, hacking into like various organizations, being able to obtain information through flaws in websites, right? There's all these kind of ways in which the Iranians perpetuated this campaign. And so this goes out, they're doing it. And, more or less, like I think the US government was able to get ahead of it. We were able to talk through what we saw, attribute it really quickly. I think in the end, like that was a big win on the US government side to be able to really put to light quickly what was going on. But the Iranians didn't stop there. And I think that's what's really what I want to talk through today. So that kind of chaos element didn't work as well as they wanted it to. So then they turned and they, thought about how they could harass us further. And this is where a cyber operation became a harassment operation, an influence operation, just kind of all wrapped into one. They developed a website and it was called Enemies of the People. Like they made themselves kind of a fake group. They put out all this information. And you saw election officials out there. They had crosshairs, which is that, like a sniper rifle crosshairs over their faces. It had pictures of their houses, where they lived, who they were, what they did. Incredibly scary things. And they did this to try to like cause fear, right? Or cause harm against individuals. And how this was identified, reacted to, and all the steps that the FBI, that the government, that election officials had to take throughout this, it was very new at the time. First is kind of understanding, what does a notification look like? So if you're out there, you're on a site and you don't know it, the FBI may not know it either, right? It depends on different types of sources. It depends on different types of items. And so that had to be identified. I think election officials might have been some of the first people telling us, right? And so the notification process of that is going to be governed by a few different items. One is like, is there a real articulated threat to life? Because that triggers something within the FBI called duty to warn, which means there is a duty to warn anybody whom there might be like an actual violence threat against, a threat to life against. Then there's other elements of, is this, does this violate other federal statutes? I think most often when information is put out online, especially if you're going to see something with, crosshairs over people's faces and the like, federal cyber stalking statutes then start coming like into play on that. Those are very long-term investigations though. And I think as a part of this, knowing that if your information is put out there, even in some much larger campaign like Enemies of the People, it's muddy at first what the intent might be. And that can also mean that when you're sitting there terrified, right, scared for your family, that on the other side, that's not necessarily having kind of that like same time horizon. And there can be like this mismatch. And I say all that because I want to talk through a few items that are helpful for really identifying what you can do today to help protect yourself further. One item is talking to your local police department. So with that, I've done this too, is if you think you're at risk for swatting, which is where somebody calls 911 on you, right? And they call the police department to your door. You can register often as a location of interest. It might be labeled something different at each local police office, but you can go talk to your local police, talk about how you might be at swatting risk, what their process is. And, that basically allows them to put like notes down. So if somebody calls 911 or something else on you for that type of activity because your information went out online, then they have a note to be like, proceed with caution, right? This person's a swatting risk. Like it's just that extra information, like letting your local police know. There's also different ways, and I think some of the other speakers are going to get into this, for being able to remove a lot of your information from online. Nothing's perfect. It is incredibly hard to do it, but yourself. If services are just able to keep up with the rate of data brokers out there, because it's important. And I've seen this too, right? Like on Twitter, people alluding to certain things that can be taken as violent threats against myself. When you see that, knowing that yes, like you should take all the things for your own family safety, for your own personal safety. But B, when more of your information gets out there, it also makes you at risk for follow-on cyber operations. So more personal information gets out about you, it might mean that you receive additional spear phishing emails or additional attempts to guess your username and password, like kind of all these other elements that happen when you get your name kind of put out there in public. And so knowing that you also might be more at risk for that kind of incoming, thinking about what that means for your posture. I've said to a lot of people, we need to zero trust our brains to a lot of these kind of lies that come in and spear phishing. And it's just so much now. Being able really to like take a beat and think about how this could also not just be the threat that somebody on a keyboard has decided to write down, but like what that could mean down the road is really important to thinking about like your full security posture, both at home and in the office. And so, I gave that iRating example to talk through what it can mean and what doxing can look like from a really malicious targeted election standpoint. But a lot of you that are on the call are probably going to be more a victim of data breaches, of cyber criminals doing types of dox, like things that would feel like doxing because it gets your personal information out there. It isn't necessarily targeted to you as election official X, but people can do these types of searches, like put two and two together. And so ensuring that you're really thinking about this holistically in terms of where your information is, how you take that down, how you monitor for your presence on these criminal forums overall, all of that's really important towards your security posture. I'm really excited to hear from some of the other folks and answer questions later. So I'll turn it back over to you, Spencer.
All right. So before, and thank you very much, Cynthia. That was amazing. So before we jump over to Amy, I have one question for you, Cynthia,
Okay.
before we get to the lightning round here at the end. What is one thing that election officials need to do this afternoon, or if they're watching this on Monday or Tuesday, what's the one thing they should be doing right away?
You need to get a handle on where your information is, right? And identify the ways in which you want to take control of it. There's a lot of different services out there that will help you identify all the places your information is across the internet and where that might be located. I'm not going to say this is like one is better than the other over here because I think all of them, like, right, are pretty reasonable and pretty good. But know that it's really difficult to do on your own and to know and understand basically just your threat posture, your threat risk, and think through then, like, do your own incident response plan in your head, right? What would I do if this happened? What would I do if it actually got out there, right? And I felt threatened.
Speaking of amazing, I want to flip over to the amazing Amy Cohen. Amy Cohen leads the National Association of State Election Directors. Many of the members that she represents has been affected by doxing themselves. And in addition, Amy has been unfortunately affected by doxing. So I'm going to turn it over here and thank you, Amy, for speaking on this topic.
Thanks so much, Spencer. And it's always nice to get to see Cynthia. It is a little overwhelming to follow her. But, as you mentioned, I'm the executive director of the National Association of State Election Directors. And I raise this point because I don't work for any elected officials. And I think that there can be sometimes this idea in our community that only elected officials are sort of at risk for this kind of activity, that it could never happen to me. And, Spencer mentioned the activity that has affected my members in the past. And I'll just say it was the Enemies of the People campaign that Cynthia talked about. And we had many members who were affected by that. And it's, I think, worth noting that some of them were people you've heard of and you would have heard of in 2020, and some of them aren't, right? We're not talking about necessarily chief election officials. We're not necessarily talking about communications directors. We're not talking about people with a massive public footprint. We're talking about people who are, we're working in their states and working with local election officials and enforcing the law and following the law. So I think it is a really important thing to remember when you're thinking this couldn't happen to me, because unfortunately we're in a position right now where working in elections means it can happen to you. And Spencer also mentioned that I've been a victim of doxing, and I was a victim of doxing in a very different way from the Enemies of the People campaign, which, as Cynthia mentioned, was a sort of targeted, malicious effort led by Iran. I was a victim of doxing in litigation. And I say to people, like, I'm nobody, right? I don't administer elections. I don't touch ballots. I don't register voters. I run a membership association. And I think what I do is really important, and I'm passionate about my job, but I'm not an election official. And my information was included in litigation that I was not party to. And it was phrased in such a way specifically to make people angry at me for things that I was being accused of things. And it was amplified by a cohort of people with a massive platform, multiple massive platforms. And so it is important to remember that it can happen to you, even if you think of yourself as sort of a behind the scenes person, and it can feel very overwhelming. I live in a city and I am a pedestrian and I'm a runner and I go out at night and I have done that for a really long time. And nothing has ever made me feel as vulnerable as being doxxed did. It just is a very strange feeling to sort of lose control of your personal safety in that way. And it has made me really think hard about the things that I put online, that I allow to be online about myself. There's a reason my background is blurred right now. My friends are hypersensitive about this, right? They won't post photos of me, things like that. But it has also made me really sensitive about the PII that is out there about me and things like that. And so the way I think about this is, in elections, when you go back 10 years to 2016, when the sort of cyber threats were first presented to us as a community, we felt unprepared, right? I think a lot of us remember those days and remember feeling really overwhelmed by what was happening and felt like sort of it was happening to us. And since 2016, we've worked really hard to prepare. How can we mitigate risks to our cyber infrastructure? How can we mitigate risks to our sort of physical infrastructure? We can do cybersecurity assessments. We can do phishing training. We can do all that stuff. We can do physical security assessments and we can do all of that stuff. And we have to start thinking of ourselves as infrastructure also. People who work in this field need to start thinking of themselves as infrastructure too. And so thinking about doxing in particular can feel very scary, especially because it when it happens, it feels very surreal. But we sort of have to get past that part of it and start thinking about, okay, what can I do to protect myself? What steps can I take to mitigate this risk? Because I think Cynthia made a really excellent point that it is going to be near impossible to get everything about yourself off the internet, right? This is a webinar geared towards election officials. So you all know that people are out there buying your voter registration lists all the time. So the data brokers who, if you're not familiar with them, those are the companies that, like, if you Google yourself or if you, Google someone you were friends with in high school to see where they are, right? That information that comes back on them, those sort of people search sites, those are data brokers, and they're compiling your information from a whole host of different places. They're getting it from government data sets. So they're getting it from the voter registration, the publicly available voter registration list. They're getting it from property records. They're getting it from all of these different places. And so there is a level of, we can't get to 100% perfect, but we can take steps to mitigate that risk and get your PII off of those brokers. And one of the challenges with sort of doing that yourself, which you can do, but it will take many, many, like hundreds of hours, is that they're constantly updating. So even if you were to do it yourself, if you were like, you know what, I'm taking several weeks and I'm just going to do this and I'm going to go in and get these all off myself, in a couple months, you're going to have to do it again. And then a couple months later, you're going to have to do it again because they're constantly updating and they're getting new sources and things like that. And so thinking about those places where your information is, you guys, all, like I said, all know you're custodians of voter registration records. So these companies are buying it a lot. And, if you are a homeowner or property owner or business owner, those are all places where they're getting your information. And so taking steps now to prepare yourself, I think, is both a smart choice in the long run because you're making it just a little harder for a bad actor to get your information, but it is also it's helpful for your mental health. So I will say, I mentioned that being doxxed really threw me in a way that I wasn't expecting. By the same token, when NASA made the decision to get me a subscription to one of these services, it was the thing that we did that made me feel the most secure, because it made me feel less alone, and like there was someone out there looking for my information in these places, so I don't have to. And it just took like a little bit of the edge off of my anxiety. Certainly other things have filled that that edge, but it did help take some of the edge off. And I've heard from my members that they have felt the same way. NASED has actually taken the step of we make it available to some of our members. So we have it is a benefit of membership that we have available. It is something that is really important for me personally. I think it's a really important service for us to offer. Again, I'll go back to part of the reason I think it's so important is because I don't work for elected officials, and there can be this idea even in election offices that it's the elected official who is sort of the primary target. And I think, I am staff at an association for staff. And so it is important to me to be these making these services available, but also making sure that my members are thinking about how to keep themselves safe and keep their families safe. I will say at the state level, I'll wrap up. I think we've gotten better thinking about this as a community, because in 2020, it really came at us out of nowhere, right? I had a lot of calls with Cynthia at the end of 2020 and early 2021 about this, and it was really scary to feel targeted by a nation state actor. But at the end of the day, no one who was on that list that I spoke to was concerned that the Iranian National Guard was going to show up at their home, right? The issue was my information is out there. I don't know who's seeing this. And there are people in my state, maybe my neighbors, who could potentially be seeing this and putting me at risk. And so I think we've gotten better at talking about this as a community and thinking about it. But I will say, I do still think there's a little bit of a disconnect where people don't think it can happen to them, and it can. And the idea here is not to be terrified. So I'm sorry, Spencer, if I've done that. But the idea is to think of yourselves as infrastructure and what you can do to protect your information and your infrastructure in a proactive way to make it just a little bit harder for bad guys. So I'll stop there.
All right. First of all, Amy, thank you. Heartfelt thank you for sharing your story and all that amazing information. So, for those who have not been through a doxing incident, what is one thing that you would tell them this week to be prepared for?
I think be ready to feel a little out of control, right? We're election officials. That's not a feeling that we like. And so you do need to sort of come to terms with feeling a little bit out of control, which is again, I think why it's so important to control what you can in the lead up. It's that has, I think, been the sort of consistent thing that I've heard from my members who have been doxxed, is just that sort of feeling of like, oh, like you can't unring the bell. So now it's out there. What do I do? And how do I fix this? And, thinking back, especially to 2020, right, when people's kids were at home for COVID, and families were sort of together way more than sort of is maybe the norm, that lack of control really felt like a big thing. And the other thing I'll say is, I emphasized a lot that I don't work for elected officials. And I think it's just also worth noting that for non-elected government officials, it can be more challenging to access security resources from your state or local government. And even, if there is, if it's, if it's like if there isn't a duty to warn, right? So if you're doxxed, but it's not like considered a serious, credible threat to safety, that can also make it more difficult to access some of those resources. And again, why it's important to have some of these conversations in advance and do some of this preparatory work because because you feel so out of control when it's happening to you. It's nice to know that you've already controlled as much as you can in advance.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Amy. And I'm with you. Any little thing that you can't control, all of us election officials or former election officials, we're all control freaks. We like to be in control of everything. And the scariest part about this is when you're not in control. So we're actually going to turn it over to Aaron. So Aaron Heyman is the founder of Social Scout. It's the only organization in the country focused exclusively on online security, physical security, and mental health support for the election community. He brings over 15 years of experience in security threat analysis for federal and state governments, non-governmental organizations, along with the private sector. So Aaron, turn it over to you. Can you walk us through what election officials can actually do to take control of their online presence and any other information you'd like to share?
Thanks, Spencer. Can you hear me? And thank you to Cynthia for sharing your kind of expertise and Amy for your experience. This is an incredibly important topic. I have to rely on the crutch of slides. So I'm going to share some slides that'll help me stay on track and hopefully convey some thoughts about what we're seeing in the very recent past with regards to trends in doxing specifically and what it means for the elections community. The thing I want to highlight and the thing and kind of how I want to frame the conversation a little bit today in my comments is really a change in mindset. And both Amy and Cynthia alluded to this, but I want to present it in a slightly different fashion. And I want to compare it to how we approach kind of the physical world. When it comes to our house, we regularly kind of take care of it, whether that's cleaning up outside and the yard work, whether that's cleaning up inside, getting rid of trash. And the reason we do that is because that type of clutter, that type of garbage, those security risks are both visible. We see them every day. We see the vulnerabilities, right? If your lock on your front door is not working, every time you come home, you notice the lock on the front door is not working. And then also because of our values, we put our time and our energy towards the things that we value. And so we want to enjoy our home, be a good neighbor, keep our family safe. And so we spend time and energy taking care of our physical world. Our digital space is a little bit different, right? The risks are often invisible, right? We don't see this information every day about ourselves. Many folks, some folks might Google themselves every now and then, but really digging in and understanding what their online presence looks like, we don't see that every day. We're often not confronted with it. The vulnerabilities change, and they've changed significantly. It's something both Cynthia and Amy touched on. 10 years ago, the internet was a very different place. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when the enemies of the people happened, the internet was also a very different place from where it is today. And the internet and these vulnerabilities are constantly evolving. And so our security habits also need to change. In terms of values, and the way I describe it is we really just need to devote the time and energy to cleaning up our digital life and our digital house the way we devote time and energy to cleaning up our physical house. So similar to taking out the trash every week and paying the garbage man to pick it up and take it away, we need to take the same approach to what is online to protect both ourselves and our families. And we're talking today in the terms of doxing, but as Cynthia and Amy have mentioned, there's also cybersecurity elements to this as well. By cleaning up your online presence, yes, you're making it harder for somebody to dox you, but you're also significantly reducing bad actors, cyber actors' ability to find, exploit you, target you for all sorts of cyber scams, in addition to kind of the doxing and physical security that we're talking about today. We've highlighted kind of the example of the enemies of the people. I want to provide a couple of very recent examples to really highlight the need for PII removal and social media hygiene. And before I go further, I just want to highlight kind of the difference between the two of those. PII removal is kind of working with those data brokers to get things taken down. Social media hygiene is all those platforms, accounts that we have set up, whether it's a Facebook or Instagram account or an old Strava account that we used to use for exercise or any kind of range of accounts. But I want to focus on the PII removal side. And this is a screenshot of a notebook that was found with the accused individual, Vance Luther Butler, who conducted the attacks that killed two individuals, the Speaker of the House of Minnesota, Melissa Hortman, and her husband at their home, and also caused serious injuries to John Hoffman, who's a state senator, and his wife at their home. And the thing I want to highlight here is, again, this is straight out of a search warrant court document from his notebook. He was using data brokers to identify where people lived. And there's a whole bunch of data brokers. He's identifying down to the fact that he could get a 3-day free trial at these and get access to kind of the locations where locations of places of potential targets and victims. And Amy touched on this better than anyone, that our personal information is in public records that we often can't remove. It is in your voter record. It is in your property records. Those are public records. They are accessible, but they're not easily accessible. It's much harder to get at those. They don't spend time trying to find these records. So when a bad actor wants to do something, they find the easiest route. And these data brokers and Google searches are often the easiest way. And by cleaning up this information, you're taking, it's a layer of defense against bad actors. It doesn't solve the entire problem, but it does put a layer of defense between you, and it makes it significantly harder for them to identify you. Now, I want to pivot from here to an actual case, because folks can say, well, my information's all over the place. Does it actually work? I got to spend the time, I got to spend the money doing this. I want to give you a recent example from somebody in the elections community that we've worked with and I'll give you a little bit of context, but it was highly effective. So this is somebody that was doxxed, or somebody attempted to dox this member of the elections community in mid-2025. Luckily, this person had taken the time to do PII removal, social media hygiene. We worked with them, helped them clean up a lot of this stuff online. And when the bad actor tried to dox them, they did post information, but it didn't have the correct home address. It didn't have the current image of their house. It didn't contain their full phone number, and it didn't contain their current email addresses. And it misidentified. They actually doxed kind of the wrong person. And so while this was very disconcerting, Amy talked about kind of how this can really have an emotional impact when your information is exposed in this way. So this person was targeted, and it was very concerning, but the risk to that individual was significantly lower because the information that was posted was not correct, was not accurate, was not current. This actor was highly effective at doxing people. And I want to walk you through kind of what they did to further highlight the value of PII removal. So first of all, this individual had doxed over 20 people in the time around when they were doxing this member of the elections community. So they doxed dozens of individuals. They doxed this member of the elections community. They doxed some very high-profile individuals, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, retired General Wesley Clark, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas. X ultimately suspended their account, and then they were ultimately arrested for cyber stalking in the months following their attempted doxing of the individual. Why were they doing this? They said online that they were doing this as a way to bring pressure on these people. They went to their job at the Pentagon or at a secure government facility. They wanted these people to feel unsafe when they were at home. So he was a highly effective actor. Well, did PII actually work? Did he maybe just make this mistake? Yes, it absolutely worked. So this is just a sanitized example of where he got the information for all the folks that he was attempting to dox. You notice he has a tendency to go to one data broker, right? We're all human, we all have habits. He would go to the same place. That would kind of be his primary search. If he didn't find it there, he would go to another. These are names of data brokers: Fast People Search, Redaris. You see Facebook there as one, right? The social media is a part of it. If you look at the elections community member, it's completely different from everything else. And why? My assessment, when he went to Fast People Search, there was nobody there because the data was wrong. So he had to go somewhere else and find another data broker. He couldn't find the individual in his normal pattern. And so he went to another data broker that he didn't use. And he ultimately just grabbed somebody who had a very similar name and grabbed their information and tried to post that, but it was not the correct individual and it was not accurate or current information. The fact that this person, the attempted doxing of this person looked fundamentally different than all the other ones suggests to me that the PII removal process worked because he couldn't go to his normal place and find the information he was looking for. So in kind of reiterate some of what Cynthia and Amy mentioned, and that is we really do need to take a little bit of stock of where we're at when it comes to our digital hygiene in our digital house and whether or not we're where we need it to be. The reality here is the internet's changing, the world is constantly changing. This data is it's not easy to get down. Some of it we can't take down, but these data broker removal services, it's highly effective. It makes it significantly harder for bad actors to find you and to find you quickly. And we see, human nature is such that if something's hard, people move on to the next thing. They'll move one step over. And so it's a highly effective way to protect you and your family. As Cynthia and Amy mentioned, there's a lot of different services out there. Think about it like a garbage bill. Think about it like taking out the trash. It's part of kind of living in the 21st century in the digital age. We need to spend some time kind of cleaning up our online presence because bad actors use these data for nefarious purposes and they work at preventing kind of bad actors from finding out where we live. So that's all I had, and I'll kind of pause there and turn it back over to you, Spencer.
All right. So again, thank you very much, Aaron. So if an election official has 30 minutes next week, this weekend, maybe over the weekend, to start protecting themselves, where should they first start spending their time?
That's a great question. I think it kind of depends on whether or not they already have a PII removal service, whether they have a subscription to Delete Me or some of these other platforms. I think one, checking to make sure if you think you have it, go double check, make sure it hasn't expired, make sure it's still working, update it. They only take down the information you put up there. So if you've moved or if something has changed, as Amy said, the data is constantly going up there. So these services are constantly looking, but there's a little bit of ownership on your side as well to make sure it's running and it has the latest information. If you haven't engaged a PII removal service, there are a lot of options out there that are not very expensive, $20 a month. Again, I keep bringing up the garbage bill. Like there's tons of platforms out there that you can employ that do a pretty good job of getting the data off the main brokers and making it a little bit harder. That's not the end of the story. There's often more that you need to do, but if you don't have one of those, highly recommend that as an initial first step.
Perfect. Thank you. And before we go to lightning round questions, I do want to highlight several election security exchange resources that we have available for the community. One of them is a guide to helping election officials mitigate doxing, which I have put links in the chat for that one. We also have a digital footprint self-assessment worksheet that election officials can use as well to kind of say what kind of stuff is available online. How can I reduce my digital footprint? And then hopefully this is something that no one has to use, but we prefer that people have access to the resource now and hope you don't have to use it. But if you do get doxxed, we want to provide an instant response guide for election officials. So what is your response plan when you are potentially doxxed? I know there are also a couple questions in the chat, which I'm actually going to copy one of the answers from our How to Mitigate Doxing guide. And the question was, what are some reputable resources out there that are available for, as Aaron mentioned and Amy mentioned and Cynthia mentioned, on PII removal? So with that being said, we are going to do a quick lightning round section. So I'm going to ask every one of our panelists to spend 5 to 10 to 30 seconds on each one of these questions. So Cynthia, what's the single most important thing an election official can do this week to reduce their exposure?
Look at the resources that you're going to send out about which service they want to use and, try to identify what matches your needs.
Amazing. Amy?
I think as election officials, we're well positioned to know about resources like confidential voter programs, address confidentiality programs, things like that. And so you can look into that and what is available to you in your state.
How about yourself, Aaron?
These things can take time, and it's not a one kind of, you do it once and you're done. Figure out how to build it into your routine and come up with a plan to, on a regular basis, I'm going to tackle a little piece of the puzzle, turn it into a habit.
All right. So next question, I'm going to start with Cynthia again. If you realize you've been doxxed, what should your first hour look like?
So I'm a mom. So if I realized I was doxxed, the first thing I would do is make sure that I told my family about what was going on and that we were going to learn more, but they needed to be, more careful, especially, doing things like opening the doors, what happens, walk them through what happens if you get swatted, etc.
All right. How about yourself, Amy?
I live in an apartment building, a very large apartment building. So I would, notify my building management, which I have also had to do. And I would also reach out to my local police department to let them know that this happened so that they could sort of walk me through what's available to me from their side.
So last question for the panelists. And Cynthia, you kind of mentioned this and you touched on this for a second. So sometimes you have to have that scary conversation with your family. So how do you have that conversation with your family in a affirming manner that helps them stay safe and also provides them some agency on how they can help keep mom safe or help keep dad safe, but also how can they themselves be safe?
So listen, I have teenagers and they don't listen all the time because you're going to walk them through, why you might be at risk, like what they need to be on the watch out for. Like we've had rules about when you're on these various online forums. If you haven't met the person in real life, you probably shouldn't be connected with them virtually, right? But that's hard. I think the bigger conversation is what happens if you think you're at risk. We have a safe word with our family, right? That we know if somebody calls and is threatening that my, kids are XYZ, I know the word to ask them for. We have practiced scripts at various ages. When they're younger, they're simpler. If police come to the door, what do you say? Right? Being very clear. My mom's at risk of swatting, basically walking through appropriate for their age, words that they repeat back to you so they know exactly what to do in those instances. And then just checking in with them, making sure that there's nothing that feels off to them as well. I think our kids are hardier than we think sometimes, and it's a hard conversation, but I think they appreciate knowing versus not knowing, and being able to be resilient in that way.
Okay, Aaron. So what do you think you should do, or election officials should do?
It's a really difficult one. Telling kids to stay off social media or be safe online is a hard challenge. One approach we've taken is trying to gamify it a little bit and specifically give them positive incentives. So, right, like you could say, hey, you're sitting around dinner table, say, hey, I've got a $25 gift card here. Everybody pull out your phone. Whoever has the most secure Instagram gets the $25 gift card, right? And you pull it out, and is your Instagram locked down? Do you have a picture of yourself, or do you have a fun picture? Do you have your full name as your Instagram account? And, as a parent, kind of change the script a little bit. Instead of telling them don't say, here's the behaviors that are positive behaviors and here's why you're staying safe, and incentivizing that. Give them, maybe a gas card for a 16-year-old means something, or maybe it's something else, right? Figure out what your kids are excited about, but try to flip the script a little bit and encourage positive behavior. Can be another route to take. Obviously, there's times you got to tell your kids, like, stop, like, this is not right. Don't do this. This is why it's concerning. But you can also try to incentivize them in another way as well.
All right. And Amy, closing thoughts for you?
But I think, having a safe word is really important. I have that with some of my friends for a variety of different reasons. And my mom and I have, in fact, talked about it because seniors are at risk also of turning over information inadvertently as well. And so, I think those are really good tips. I would just say, in general, when you're thinking about this, don't get overwhelmed because it it sounds a little silly, but like this is really something like you can't fix it in a couple minutes, but you can take a really significant step in just a couple of minutes, right? Like once you decide I do want to use one of these services to get my PII off the internet, it is as simple as signing up for that service, right? If you're doing it for yourself personally, right? So don't get overwhelmed.
All right, amazing. So first of all, I want to thank our panelists here today for taking time out of their very busy days. Cynthia, thank you very much for all your expertise and your service to the nation. Amy, as well, for all of your expertise and service to the nation. And Aaron, thank you for helping keeping election officials safe and all the amazing work that you do. So as a reminder for attendees, I put a couple links out in the chat. We will also be sending out a follow-up email for both everyone who attended the webinar, along with anyone else who signed up for Election Security Exchange emails with some of these links as well. And if you do have a moment for this weekend, take a couple minutes, read the couple of our guides, sign up for our newsletters, and remind your friends to sign up for newsletters. And on that, I hope everyone has an amazing weekend and a safe weekend. And thank you very much. Have a great day.